Shadiversity.
Greetings, I am Shad, and with the recent release of the Final Fantasy VII Remake, I am going to be taking a look at one of the classic swords. Now, what's interesting is when Final Fantasy VII comes up, people usually look at Cloud's Buster Sword, which is a really fun pop culture weapon to deconstruct to figure out what it would really be like in real life and things. But that's already kind of been done, quite a lot. But what's odd about it is that there's a really significant and rather unique kind of sword in Final Fantasy that I haven't seen anyone look at yet, and that is Sephiroth SWORD. It's not just a regular katana, it is a massive katana, like of insane proportions, okay? Now, obviously, just by looking at it, we can see that's not a practical sword. There are a lot of issues with it, but it's fantasy, okay? It's for fun, and I get that completely. But part of having fun with it as well is to try and figure out what would a weapon like that be like in real life, okay? And then we can try and analyze it, what it would be like for a regular person using it, but also what about for someone who actually has legitimate superhuman strength like Sephiroth? How functional a weapon would it actually be in universe, okay, in the Final Fantasy VII universe? And one of the ways we'll get a baseline of how functional it would be is by also comparing it to the largest swords that did exist in our own history, the big ones, all right? And so to get an idea of what this sword would be like, you know, holding something of that size, you know what I've done? Oh my flippin' goodness, do you see the size of this thing? And I was doing my best to try and work off of the images. And something interesting about, you know, the Sephiroth sword from Final Fantasy, I believe it's called Masamune, is it seems to get bigger with each iteration. So if you look at Final Fantasy Advent Children, like, it's kind of like this, and in the, you know, Final Fantasy VII Remake, they kind of stuck with that size, and measuring it off Sephiroth's height, it seems to be about 3 meters in length, and that's exactly the length what I've made here. This is just pure insanity. Do you see this? Oh my goodness, it's hard to even keep it, like, in frame on camera for you to see the proportions of something like this. And, oh my goodness, can you, like, thinking about wielding something like this, there is a lot of interesting elements to consider. So let's get into it. The first part is going to be the issue of length. Now, this is nowhere near as a problem with someone with insane superhuman strength, but it will give us an insight as to the level of strength Sephiroth must have to use something like this. And, you know, would it be in the same ballpark as Cloud's Buster Sword? Yes and no. The Cloud's Buster Sword honestly would take more strength to wield than this, because even with how incredibly long it is, it has an interesting advantage. It's so slender, and the overall mass, because of that, isn't actually as high as what we see on the Buster Sword, because the Buster Sword, because it has such a large surface area, it probably has twice the mass of Sephiroth's sword here. And again, it's like it's even getting in camera, right? This is just pure insanity. But with length comes an interesting kind of physics phenomenon. And that is the nature of torque. Torque is simply the force that is placed on a point of rotation. And so whatever, you know, point where I'm actually the main, you know, support you are applying to the weapon is, that's where the point of rotation, if it's here. But of course, that's going to be where the handle is, or the highest point in which you can hold it on the handle, which is right there. Like, the torque I'm feeling on my wrist is pretty extreme. And how it works is that basically the force that is pushing downwards is multiplied by the distance that the center of gravity is from the point of rotation. And so the center of gravity is about here. And like holding the sword, you know, at the center of balance, cake, not a problem. You know, you can do it here. But as soon as you move the center of balance away, a little bit more, a little bit harder, gets harder and harder and harder and harder, till the point you get there, it's like, you can barely do it. So that torque plays a number on your wrist. The next thing, of course, that is obvious, this is a wooden one. It's not steel, okay? There's some interesting, you know, things that you might think that a steel one would just be like 5-10 times heavier. Not necessarily. To get the structure and stability in a wooden one, I've needed to make this thick. So that enables that it won't just snap when I hold it horizontal like that. I think it's safe to assume that Sephiroth's sword is made out of a fantasy super strong material. So that means the sword could actually be made super thin. And if you make it super thin, even though steel is heavier, its weight actually might not be insane. And one of the interesting things that helps us at least try and give this sword that acknowledgement is that it's hard to kind of see the exact width of Sephiroth's sword. Contrast that with Cloud's Buster Sword, because it has such a distinct spine, we can see how thick that sword is. And even just measuring off the standard weight of steel, it comes in ridiculously heavy. But with Sephiroth's one, it's hard to tell. And perhaps we can try and, give a small little concession that might not necessarily be in the law, but because it's not defined in the law, you could try and say it's really thin, which actually could possibly put its weight in the same realms as this wooden one, which is so thick. Maybe a bit heavier. The other thing that you would be able to do is adjust the point of balance, okay? Swords, you want to get a lower point of balance, not as low as possible. Of course, I need to take this out of my back scabbard because when I start swinging these big ones around, it might hit the handle. Now, this is actually a poor example of point of balance because this is a wall hanger. It's not meant to be functional. And so, but even with this one, you can see the point of balance is close-ish to the handle. And with a more functional longsword, probably around there is the common point of balance that you will find. Sometimes they can get really low, and that gives you a huge amount of point control, because even with regular swords, that same concept of torque applies very much so, okay? At higher point of balance, more torque, lower point of balance, even if it's actually heavier, if it has a lower point of balance, it can feel lighter because there's actually less force pushing against your wrist, there's less torque. Even if it is actually heavier, it would feel lighter because of that phenomenon. And I actually don't know why I put that away.
Well, then why'd you do it?
I just like it. I'm sorry. Now I need to take it out. Anyway, so if this sword could be made out of that super advanced material that is just incredibly strong, and by the way, it would actually need to be, because if you made this out of steel with, say, even the standard thickness, that torquing force would be so great, especially when you did, like, say, a big sweeping strike and you needed to stop it right before it came down. The force would be so great that it would probably buckle and bend right in the midpoint and just go like that. I've talked about that in my video on really big giant swords. It's an issue. Steel has a strength limitation when you ramp it up in size. It's a square cube law, okay? You will increase the strength of a material when you increase its volume, but you're increasing its weight by a greater factor, a factor of 8, when you increase its overall size. And there's a crossover point where its own weight becomes greater than its own structural strength that it has to support that weight. And that's what you would find with steel with giant swords like this. So they actually need to be made out of a fantasy material to even function so effective. When I say function effective, I'm talking about staying together, not breaking, in terms of their functionality in use. That's a different topic, but for them to stay together so firmly while being used, it needs to be some type of magical sci-fi, advanced material. Same with the Cloud's Buster Sword, same with this one. And because of that, you would be able to get away with the blade being so much thinner. And then you can also try and add other elements of, practical sword design and construction, like having a distal taper, like a really distinct distal taper. I actually have one on here. You can't see it because of the perspective. It just gets ridiculously big. Like, look at that. Like, oh, sword! So, distal taper, but that would help lower the point of balance and then counterbalance in the hilt. And you've got a nice long hilt here that you could put something decently heavy to the point where you could actually get a fairly functional point of balance in this sword if you could work within the realms of fantasy sci-fi materials. So yes, in the context of the world, you could make a sword that isn't as unwieldy as even this wooden one that I've made. So then comes the question of, could you use it in combat? Now, what's interesting, with the things that we've just gone over, surprisingly, you might not necessarily need superhuman strength to wield a sword like this. Thin blade, sci-fi material, lower point of balance, more control. You could probably get it almost in the ranges of this, wooden one. And then, now I can actually try and get some movement with it to see what could you do with something like this. And it's interesting. So one of the huge strengths and advantages this have would be in the tip speed, because look how far my hands move. Oh, I see that? That's the length of my hand. But then compare that to how much the tip is moving over the same time frame, okay? The tip speed is going way faster, and the longer the blade, the higher the tip speed. And then if the tip is moving faster, that means the momentum is greater. So momentum is a combination of its mass and velocity. And then if you have something of high momentum on a very, very fine edge, really, really thin, when it impacts something, it creates a shearing force, or what we colloquially call a cut. The thinner, finer the edge, the less force needed to create that shearing effect. And it's created through pressure. So, and if you combine that really thin, even, indestructible, or effectively indestructible edge with such speed and velocity, the cutting power of this thing would be insane. It would just be absolutely crazy, okay? Now, that's the biggest advantage it would have. The other advantage, of course, is its reach. I mean, you talk about, reach advantage. Look at this thing, okay? So, interesting thing about reach. The weapons that were used in historical warfare to maximize their reach, spears specifically, have a distinct weakness. And that is if you get past the offending tip, the blade, okay? If you're fighting someone with a spear, if you can pass that tip and get from here down to the shaft, they're basically safe, okay? Now, it is possible to pull the spear back and try and offend them at a closer range, but it's difficult, and I've practiced this with sparring, and the key is to get past the first kind of attack with your sword or whatever, and then you close really quickly on them before they can either move back or get the tip back to then offend you. Could you do that with the Sephiroth's sword? Well, this is one of the advantages about swords. There's still a blade. In fact, there's a blade all the way down until the handle. And so even if, they get past the point, there's a lot of blade that can still offend the opponent. And I mean, what you're noticing right here, in real life, if someone got past the tip of this, I could do a push cut or a draw cut and offend them that way, but I wouldn't be able to produce a lot of energy and force in a kind of side cut because I just don't have the strength. And this is the other potential weakness about such a big sword. It has a lot more stationary inertia, so it's harder to accelerate. From a stationary position like this to get into a cut, did you see the amount of effort I need to throw into this to get it into like a cut from this position? Gosh. So, yeah, right? Now, that would be the limitation for someone, a puny mortal like me, but for someone with superhuman strength, that wouldn't be an issue. And so, if they get past the offending tip, Sephiroth could do an insanely fast cut, just across that distance, and still, attack the opponent. So, another interesting advantage of a giant sword. I'm going to bring in the other great swords, because now we're getting into the realm of where I can reference them. No. Service of heaven, seat of power is in danger. Yes, I'm a fan of Sabaton. Favourite song now. So, obviously, I'm kind of reaching a bit to try and think of any possible advantage for this kind of sword. And some aren't that hard to think of. There are obvious ones that are just pushed to an insane extreme, and I will get to the obvious impracticalities next. But before I get there, I do want to talk about the other big advantage of such big swords, comparing them against, swords of more realistic proportions. And that's exactly what swords like this were used for. And it's in wide sweeping cuts to give you more area control. Now, I need to make sure I'm away from that stand. So, can you imagine the range, I'm almost hitting the castle behind me, of and I did hit the castle. Yes, obvious limitation, big one. We'll talk about that. Can you imagine a big cut like that just sweeps along? Now, I will attempt some of the montante kind of styled maneuvers with something like this, but to show you, comparing it to some more, when I say more realistic, that one's obviously fantasy, all right? In actual fact, it is a prop of a specific fantasy sword from pop culture, but only people of exceptional culture will be able to pick out where that's from. I won't give any clues, but if you can pick out what this sword is a very rough replica of, well, you win. You win, okay? Win what? The satisfaction of winning. Swords obviously did get very big historically, and this one here is a far more realistic example of what the historical greatsword proportions were. Coming up to about my head height, there is a range, okay, and it's an interesting point where what is a crossover. One of my OG videos back in the day talks about a crossover when a long sword comes a great sword, because in the video I mentioned this is the odd one out. Is it a great sword or is it a long sword? I would more accurately identify it as a war sword these days, but a war sword is a war sword, a long sword, or a great sword, because well, you say, no, it's just a war sword. All right, it's an effective definition then, but you could rightly call this a great sword. And you could rightly call it a long sword. It's right in the crossover point, and comes up to about your armpit, okay? Right there in that crossover thing. But if you're looking at obviously distinct, unquestionable great swords, you're looking at something like this, okay? Montante, Zweihander, Flamberg, all under the umbrella of the greatsword family of swords. There are some cases of them getting even bigger than this. They're more exceptional, which is why I have this one here, because this one basically represents as big as a sword could possibly get in terms of length, not width, all right? If this was made in real life, you wouldn't be able to lift it. If it had proportions like this, you know, slender and long, they could reach this size. They're right on the very limit, okay? And what the length of this enables is something that you actually generally don't see in historical combat, and that is spinning, all right? And so in some of the Montante styles and everything, you see these big, wide, sweeping attacks, okay? And they're going around, and they're continuing, and they're getting faster and faster and faster. And what's amazing about this, it's offending everything around me, okay? Because on the forward strike, and edge alignment is the thing that I would need to practice, because, you know, is it better to cut like that, or maybe do the reverse cut and then bring it around? But basically there needs to be a transition where it twists. And so the forward one, of course, offends, but then after it twists to move around, you've got the back strike, which also offends. And even, you know, when you're striking and it needs to twist for you to rotate, people aren't going to want to be hit by that anyway. There's a lot of mass. Well, effectively, it's actually far less mass than you would suppose for something of this length, but still, you know, more mass than a regular sword, and you wouldn't want to get hit with it. And so out of any weapon that existed historically, the great sword, okay, the Montante, Zweihander style great swords, is optimized more than so many other weapons to take on multiple opponents. Can you beat more than one opponent? Yeah, it's difficult, okay? And there comes a limit of it gets too much, but there are actually effective tactics that can be employed to mitigate those disadvantages. And being able to offend a very wide range around you like this is exactly one of those tactics. People have theorized that the great sword, or Montante in this specific instance, was used as a type of bodyguard weapon to protect an individual. Check out this sword by Montantero, I believe the YouTube channel is. A link in the description below. Great YouTube channel. And they show these techniques, what I'm talking about, different stages and styles of this style of great sword fighting, because there are other, you know, styles and techniques. You can see Dave Rawlings demonstrating some with his one, where they're kind of wide cutting motions like this, which are also really awesome and interesting. So there's actually a lot of resources to see, you know, the ways that these are fought. And there are certain longsword techniques that you just wouldn't be able to, you know, do, because there are certain, you know, limitations even with this one, and that is the length of the blade, okay? One of the dangers of great swords like this, hitting the ground, that's going to be multiplied so much more when we start applying some of these techniques with Masamune, Sephiroth SWORD. So interestingly, some of those techniques can be legitimately transferred to a sword of insane length like this. Not all of them, because that limitation of hitting the ground, as I mentioned, you just can't do it. I mean, like, you hit the ground, and that is one of the, like, things that break the concept of this sword. It is honestly too long for practicality in most situations. Could there be specific situations where you could just go insane with something like this? Yeah, if you had enough room around you, okay, then you could probably go nuts. Now, honestly, even in my big backyard like this, I don't have enough room. But I think, well, actually maybe, I'm like off to the side of the camera, so you're not going to see everything, but I just need to make sure I don't hit the castle if I get back here, all right? So I'm getting hit there as well. Okay, so I've moved the camera to the spot in my backyard where I have a bit more room, and let's just make sure I'm not hitting anything. Okay, all right. Let's try this out. So you have maybe a wrath stance, something like that. You go in for a big slash, and then you go again. Oh, this is working. Oh my goodness! And you're just offending everyone around you. Whoa! Oh, how fast can I go? That's crazy. And what's also crazy, the blade is in line with the first sweep, all right? And now I'll show you from my in line, and then when I come around for the back sweep, it's in line again for the back cut. And then it's in line basically all the way around. So I go to that back cut motion, and it's just going helicopter of death, Zweihander, mega Masamune Sephiroth sword style. But oh my goodness, I can't get any faster than that. Whew. Well, that was actually surprisingly effective. Even with a sword of these proportions, I was able to spin it and swing it around with some of those great sword styles. The main thing you need is room, and that's when the weaknesses of this sword really comes into play, because just carrying this around would just be insanely impractical. Like Sephiroth, does he carry it around, or can he summon it? Because it kind of gets summoned in Advent Children. Maybe like Sephiroth's base just has hallways that are 5 meters wide, and every room is like 10 by 10 at minimum. You imagine him walking around and someone's behind him, and like he goes to look behind him. What was that? Hugely impractical. But if you could summon it, okay, and use some magic kind of things, that would mean you avoid the impracticality of carrying the thing around, and then you just need the space and room to do it. Now, I mean, if you're in a forest and you have superhuman strength, you could just like destroy everything around you, cut everything into pieces with the slashes. It'd just be pure destruction incarnate, right? So that could, solve the problem of not enough space to use this effectively, but it could be used. And what's interesting, okay, is I can get away with some kind of like interesting maneuvers. Like you go for a weird kind of low guard, you're slashing around, and you can go like it's got too much momentum to redirect quickly. But if it was stiffer and superhuman strength, I think Sephiroth might actually be able to do these tight kind of exchanges, sword cuts and everything, like bang, 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 shing, 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 doing all this kind of crazy stuff. And, okay, yeah, he could probably get away with it. And honestly, like breaking this down in detail, the fact that even if people pass the tip and you can slash on the side and things, it's more practical than I was originally. I was thinking, it's just too big. It's like insanity. You wouldn't be able to do it. And there are those like crazy limitations of space. But if you had the strength and had the space and you didn't need to carry it around, all right, I think there are some advantages to it, surprisingly. I wasn't expecting to say that, but combine it with certain great sword techniques and everything, there we go. Oh boy, this was an interesting and exhausting one. Just to update, yeah, I am feeling better after surgery, guys, but still struggling some days, and unfortunately this is one of those days where it's a little bit more difficult, but doing it for you, okay? And it was a lot of fun. This thing is just, like I said, insanity. So thank you for watching. Please, guys, do check out that Kickstarter for the short film. It'd mean the world to me. It really would. If we can get that short movie made and reach some of those stretch goals, imagine how cool, awesome short film with more realistic, historically inspired sword fights of proper quality, and who knows, maybe we can get a trend going, but it needs your support to be successful. So please contribute if you can, or share it. Link is in the description below. And thank you so much for watching. Huge amounts of fun this video. I've hoped you've had fun watching it, and of course, I hope to see you again. So until that time, farewell.